Hi everyone, my name's Hannah Verslues, and for my book report, I read Lev Vygotsky's book about thought and language. This is what the book looks like if anyone wanted to learn more about it or even purchase the book on their own. So, to begin with my presentation, I wanted to do an icebreaker that kind of goes over a concept that he has in his book. So, can you think of an example where the words you used made a difference in how you understood something? So, just let that sink in and maybe think of an example on your own. And so, just a little bit more about Lev Vygotsky is that he was born in Orsha, Belarus, in a middle class Jewish family. He earned a law degree at Moscow State University and studied sociology, linguistics, psychology, and even philosophy. I thought it was interesting how he got a law degree because most of these philosophers kind of started with either psychology or philosophy. To continue on, just kind of a table of contents for my book report presentation. So we'll start with an overview of the book, just going over what all happened in the main points, and then we'll do chapter summaries, which is 7 different chapters, and then move on to key concepts and conclude with discussion questions. So the summary of the book is that the focus is on the role of language in thought development, and Vygotsky compares his theories between those of Piaget and Stern. Overall, the idea of thought and language had a huge impact on psychology as well as his theories that he introduced within this book. So within chapter 1, Vygotsky points out that thought and language are studied both independently, and he came to the conclusion that thought and speech are independent and pure. And by having studied each of them apart from the other, they are able to see the relation between them simply as mechanical external connection between two distinct processes. In addition to that, this chapter highlighted that inner speech organizes the conscious mind as well as imprints on it. Inner speech also serves as the transition piece for when thought moves to external speech. And lastly, the meaning of word is important because without meaning, a word is just an empty sound with nothing behind it. Now, moving on to chapter 2, this is when Vygotsky compared his theories to those of Piaget's, which would be the theory of child speech and thought. It was found that play dominates a child's thought up to age 7 or 8, depending on the child. This consists of things like movements, gestures, or even mimicry. Because play dominates a child's thought in Piaget's theory, it is hard for a child to decipher between what is reality versus what is make believe. So it's kind of just hard to separate those two. And then along with that, it also highlights egocentric and socialized thought. He believes that once a child does grow up, their egocentric speech grows and disappears into socialized thought. However, Vygotsky disagrees with this because he believes that it transforms into socialized thought and speech. This chapter also made it very clear that communication is the primary function of speech for both children and even adults. Now, in the next chapter, chapter 3, Vygotsky compared his theories to Stern. Stern believes that there are 3 different roots of speech, which include expressive, social, and intentional tendencies, and he defines intentionality as the ability to use sounds when referring to different things. He also believes that 2-year-olds are able to be aware of different symbols and what they mean, but all other studies show that this is beyond the ability of this age group of 2-year-olds. Intentionality develops from a child's gestures and first words. However, Stern refused to believe this concept because first words typically focus on things like objects and not emotions, which is why he had challenged that intentionality develops first. Now, with chapter 4, it focuses a lot on how language does not depend on sound. For example, there are things like sign language, gestures, and even lip readings that can be in a form of communication without sound. So just that really hit home with this whole idea that language does not revolve around sound because there's so many ways around words and things like that. And then any way a functional use of sound exists can play a significant role in the speech or language development of people. It is important to note that thinking comes before speech because without thinking, there would be no discovery of speech. There are many changes that occur between thought and speech. This includes when an individual stages of speech move from babbling to crying to eventually first words. So just really thinking of a baby. At first, they babble and then they cry, and then it moves on to words like mama or dada, not really full sentences. So, to further explain at age 2, the curves of development of thought and speech separate, meet, and join to initiate a new behavior. And then within chapter 5, it's focused on how technically language is complex thinking. For example, children and adults think in many different ways, but they can think about the exact same thing. Also, the naming of objects can be very complex because the groupings can be based on various associations. For example, the book points out that there's a human leg as well as a leg of a table, and there's so many more examples that you can think of. And then, along with that, the history of language shows that there are a variety of synonyms that exist in each and every language. For example, it pointed out that in Russia, I believe, there's there's the moon in the sky, and then there's another type of moon. Now, moving on, I wanted to ask a question before we got into chapter 6. So just think of, in what ways can the zone of proximal development be used to bridge the gap between a child's current abilities and their potential growth? So just let that sink in for a little bit, because the zone of proximal development is a key concept of Vygotsky. So within chapter 6, it's mainly all about the zone of proximal development and scientific and spontaneous concepts. The zone of proximal development is the distance between what a child can do by themselves versus what they can do with the help of someone else, whether that's guidance or support or anything of that nature. And this idea is a key concept of Vygotsky's and one of his most important topics in all of his success in psychology. Spontaneous concepts develop through everyday experiences and social interactions, whereas scientific concepts are learned in structured educational settings and are more abstract, systematic, and consciously understood. And then here is a diagram to further go into that. So in the middle is kind of what you can do on your own without any help, and it kind of works its way up. So then the zone of proximal development is what they can do with help, and then moving up is what they cannot do without any help, or just what they cannot do at all. They can't reach it. And then lastly, in chapter 7, it was made clear that thought and word have more differences than they do similarities, as previously believed for Vygotsky. This is because thought undergoes a variety of changes before it becomes speech. It was also noted that inner speech is considered just for yourself, whereas external speech is the opposite to others. To conclude, egocentric speech comes before inner speech in terms of development because it transforms one into the another. All in all, thought and language are fundamental to understanding human consciousness. Now, moving on from that, we're going to go over some key concepts. So we did just talk about the zone of proximal development, but I also wanted to point out that just a reminder that knowing what a child can do independently versus what they can do with assistance. And then the second key concept of the book would be the role language plays in cognitive development. With that, it's a tool for thinking, not just communication, as well as enables problem solving, abstract thinking, and self-regulation. And then just some discussion questions to end would be: the first one, how can parents promote a child's cognitive development by encouraging both independent thinking and collaborative learning with peers, as well as what are some ways that parents can create a supportive learning environment at home that aligns with Vygotsky's theory of learning through social interaction and guided participation. And then I just wanted to say thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope you learned a lot of Vygotsky's theory of thought and language and can use it moving on in this class and just in life in general. Thank you for watching.